Okay, we are recording.
Good. All right.
So we have to ask, we want to ask a question. I want to know when Mom started ice skating.
I started ice skating in Vienna, and I must have been about 4 years old. And I remember there was a competition in costumes. And I didn't win the competition because the other girl, I think one of us was in satin and the other was in fur. And we were dressed as cats, and I can't remember which of the two of us won. But my brother told me I was the prettier one.
About that, huh?
But I can remember at the same skating rink, this girl who was a fabulous skater fell, and somebody skated into her and cut her leg with their blade. And I was terribly upset.
How old were you when you started skating?
I did a lot of skating in Central Park when we moved to New York.
Oh, really?
I skated in New York, and a group of people together. I did figure skating, I did skating being lifted up and thrown around, and I don't remember when I stopped.
I guess I have to ask another question because maybe everybody else knows, but I don't.
When was I born?
When you left Austria, how did you leave?
We went first to Hungary. From Hungary, we went somehow to the south and got on a boat in
Trieste.
Trieste. We were on the boat, and I remember stopping, I think in Algiers, and seeing women in white, robes covered up, and being very surprised about that. And on the boat, what was the name of Baumgart? Was it Baumgart?
Holzmeister.
Holzmeister. What was his first name?
Martin.
Martin. He was about 18 and I was 5. And I was madly in love with him because he was gorgeous, tall and good looking. And they were on the boat with us. And his father, I think, had been a famous scene designer for opera primarily, right?
I don't know too much about the father.
Baumgartner was a friend of Opa wasn't Baumgartner the friend of Opa in Izmir?
I don't
What
know.
another name?
Well, I'll fill in a little bit on we went from Austria, from Vienna, to a little town outside of Budapest called Marieveșnir, where my grandmother had a resort. She had a large building and 3 or 4 smaller buildings. And we stayed there for several months with my father, because my father had escaped earlier, and my mother stayed behind in Vienna to get permissions to leave and get permissions to take things out. They stored the furniture because they expected we would go back.
Yeah, we thought we'd be back in a year.
So the furniture was stored, and we took, my father took some of his medical equipment with him, or my mother got it for him. And Elizabeth and I were in Hungary, but I think we went back to Vienna at least once. And then we went back to Hungary, and we stayed there until December. My father escaped in August, and I think we went to Vienna probably in September. And then we left Hungary at the end of December because my father was no longer allowed to stay in Hungary. He only had a very limited visitor visa in Hungary, even though he'd been born in Hungary. By then he was an Austrian citizen.
Oh,
So he had only a limited permission. And then we took a train from Budapest to Trieste to the boat. And I remember the train ride because my mother was very sad, and I asked her why she was sad. She said she was sad because she'd lost
the
a piece
pin,
of jewelry, yes.
the white thing that would look like it had a moss inside it.
Right. That's what she said she lost. Somebody, when I told somebody this story, I said, do you think maybe she was sad for another reason? She was leaving a family, you know, she had a very large extended family in Vienna. She'd been there all her life. And now she was off to, you know, places unknown, not knowing what was going to happen. And so we took this boat from Trieste, stopped in Algiers, and then on to Rio. And then we got to Rio, I don't know, 10, 12 days later, however long the boat ride was. And there we were met by representatives of Catholic charities or Catholic services or something, people who were helping refugees. And they found us a place to stay, and it was I guess a small room, and they knew there were 2 children, but they didn't know how old the children were, so both Elizabeth and I were in cribs the first night, although we were 5 and 6.
And something happened, and I couldn't sleep or something, and my mother got in the crib and gave me the bed. My mother was sleeping with her feet up in the air.
That would be like her, yeah. And then eventually they found us another place, and eventually a 3rd place, so we stayed in different places. But the problem was that, I mean, the good news was we had a visa, so they could leave Europe, and that was a big problem, because anybody who had any Jewish connection was trying to get out, and there were no visas. My father, I know some of this because we found letters that they had written, and he wrote letters to Canada, to the United States, to here, to there, and did we go to India, did we go to Iraq, did we go to Egypt?
I thought we had gotten permission to go to England.
Well, if you went to England, they would go to England so he could take a test to be qualified as a doctor, because there was an opening in Kenya. Kenya was looking for doctors. But the problem was that the exam was not for another 8 months. And of course, he couldn't stay where he was for 8 months. So,
I thought the problem came up that they had sent money to a sponsor, and the sponsor had kept the money, and then he had died, and nobody knew where the money was.
well, that's a good story. I don't know that story. No, it could be a real story. There was one story that I remember of money being in an account in Switzerland. And
That was
and then my father went to get the money in Switzerland, there was nothing there. So that was one story I remember, but that's all
I thought he didn't know
secondhand.
the code.
Yeah, possibly. Anyway, so then they were in Brazil, but because we had a visitor's visa, you were not allowed to work. You could not earn money as a visitor, you could only visit, so we're tourists. So both my mother and father were trying to earn some money, because they only had so much money with them. Had the 2 children, they had a fee, they had to pay the rent. And so my mother was teaching either English or piano, where she could find somebody who would pay her for that. And my father was working, doing some kind of filing or research for somebody, a professor who was willing to work with him under the table. And then a baron, his title was baron, I don't know whether he was German or Austrian, probably German.
I think he was German.
Had a tapioca factory about, today it would probably take you 8 or 10 hours to drive up there, a little town on the coast. And they gather tapioca, the plant, and then they would grind it and make a flour out of it. And then he built a ship, and they carried the tapioca flour down to Rio for selling to the market. And he hired my father for something in the factory. I think he was a personnel manager or something.
But mainly for his medical knowledge.
But mainly, the Baron had a wife and a daughter living with him in this little village, which was at least, 6-hour drive over very difficult roads to the nearest town where there was a doctor. He said, well, if I get my own doctor, So my father went there and worked in the factory, but also did a lot of delivering of babies and other things in the neighborhood, which made my mother very nervous in the beginning because she said, well, you've never delivered babies, you're a surgeon, this was not your business. He wasn't really a surgeon, he was a urologist, but did some surgery. And, but he ended up, doing whatever it took locally. And then I remember that there was one story, some of this I know because my mother wrote a draft of a book about a time in Brazil, and there was a terrible accident where a truck carrying a lot of children coming back from a trip somewhere flipped.
Ooh.
And a lot of people were very badly injured. So my father had trained a young man as a kind of a first aid helper, and the two of them went and, they did 15 operations, in the course of the rest of the day and the night to save as many people as they could. But we lived first we lived in the Baron's house, and then we were moved to a shed, not a shed, a house, small house that had 2 rooms, I think, which they used as a kind of an office, and that was our home until they built the house. And they actually built a house for us which must have had probably 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a bath. And when I went to Barra last year with John and Ariel, and we found the Baron's house. It actually has a plate on it, Baron Kummer, whatever his name was, house. And we found the factory, but the factory had been disassembled. So they were just, the floors and a couple of beams. And then there were walls, so we couldn't get over to where I thought our first house had been. And then I was looking for the house we lived in. I couldn't be sure which one it was, because all the houses I saw seemed bigger than I remembered. Well, we took some pictures, and so it was interesting to go there and see the village.
The thing that you were saying about the one side of Daddy's practice, what I remember is, there were all the local village huts where they weren't really black people, they were more mulatto. And any child that he delivered, they were so grateful he delivered them well, they wanted to give them his name, so they were Arturo or Artura. So there are a lot of little kids running around Ipapapuena called. At this point they might be considerably older, but that, I don't know how true that was.
No, that's what
But I remember
Grandma's
that.
story was that
That
the
was
first
another
child
child.
that was born was named Artura. It was a girl, and the woman said, I want to name him after you. So, well, I'm a man, and we'll call her Artura. But I remember going to one of the houses. He took me with him once to visit when he went to see a patient, and the houses were, I guess they call it wattle. They were
They were
mud
I
houses.
must have gone with you because I remember.
On twigs and wood, and then mud was on the walls, and then the ceiling was thatch. And when you went in, it was basically one large room, and the house I went into had one large room with a kind of a wall that was half into the room, so that it kind of divided, the sleeping quarters from the living quarters, and a dirt floor, of course. So a very simple life for them. Our house was fancier. We had a real floor, and we were off the ground a little bit. And we were at the edge of the village, because beyond us was open land, and then into the woods, the pasture nearby, because I remember some horses sometimes feeding nearby our house. And then from our house, it was a pretty straight walk of a couple of blocks down to the river. And there was this river that fed to the ocean, and sometimes they would go by boat across the river, which was about as wide as, you know, the width of this house. And on the other side were sand dunes, and beyond that was the ocean, long beach that went forever. And I remember we went there once, and my mother had a heat stroke. And actually she wrote about that in her book, because she uses it as an occasion to, you know, to say she had the heat stroke, but then she has a vision, or what do you call it,
Hallucination?
a what?
Hallucination?
Yeah, hallucination, something, you know, while she's in the heat stroke, and that allows her then to tell a story about back in Hungary or Budapest or Vienna, whatever. So she used that as a way to tell us, and I can't remember which story she told then, maybe about when they were first getting engaged. And her mother was trying to persuade her not to marry my father because,
You don't know who he is.
well, it wasn't that so much. It was that they had sent, you know, they'd sent a brother ahead to check on the family, and he came back and he said, you know, it's a wonderful family. But when they were going by train, according to my mother in this thing, they were going by train to visit the family. My grandmother, my mother's mother, and my mother's father, with my mother, going to visit my father's family. And they went, and on the trip, my grandmother kept saying to my mother, you know, don't do this, you know, we've been a Catholic family forever, and, you know, you really shouldn't, you should stay Catholic. And my grandfather kissed my mother on the forehead and said, but look at how happy he makes her. So that was then the seal of approval. So then they get there, and my father's mother is standing on the steps of the house, and as they come up, you know, she opens up her arms, and so that was sort of, then my mother's mother couldn't resist, you know, the embrace, so then that was the other seal, so then they got married.
I remember her. I remember my father's mother, but I don't remember ever meeting my father's father.
No, he died long before they were married. He died about 1919, I think, and they were married in 1931. Both our mother's parents were alive,
Yeah, I
and we
remember
knew them.
them. I
And the
remember.
grandmother was living out there, not in Budapest, but in Weiser, to a little place where we went. And she lived until the end of the war, just before the end of the war, when the Russians were coming. And the first story I heard is she committed suicide when the Russians were coming for fear of what she'd heard about the Russians. But the story I then heard, which seems truer because I guess I read it again, she was being hidden. But let's go back. What happened was,
Yeah.
Jews in Hungary were fine. There was no problem. And the Germans allowed the Hungarians to rule in Hungary. They were allies. The Hungarians had allied with the Germans. And the Germans allowed the Hungarians to run their country.
Can I sit over here, Joe?
And when the war turned the other way, and the Russians were coming, and it was clear that the Russians were going to come into Hungary, the Germans took over the government because they were afraid the Hungarians might surrender. So the Germans came into Hungary with about a year left in the war, and they made a determined effort to kill all the Jews in Hungary.
Yeah,
So there was
that's-
a really very well organized organized program to collect all the Jews in Hungary and send them off to the camps. My grandmother was being hidden, and hidden by, I don't know who, somebody. And my father's sister, Bergie, was married to a very nice man. My father was very fond of him. I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, that fellow,
Was it
Ishkan.
Pishta.
Pishta.
And Pishta was bringing some medicines to my grandmother. And somebody realized, a German sympathizer realized what was happening. And they followed Pishta. And so they knew where my grandmother was, and they reported it. And when my grandmother realized that she was going to be picked up, she committed suicide by just taking, an overdose of medicine.
She just kept them. When he came each time to visit her,
Yeah.
she kept them and then took them all together.
Yeah, because I remember my father was very deeply saddened when he got the news that she died. Because it was really, probably within months of the end of the war. Although God knows what would have happened when the Russians got
The
there.
thing which impressed me when I went to Budapest with a friend, we were taken around by some very young men as our guides, which, we'd been told about renting a car and they would guide us. And one of the things they told us to see was the Museum of Horror. And I said, why should we see that? Because and I was surprised they were young people. I mean, they were younger than you. They were as young as your children, maybe a little bit older. And some other friends of mine recently went to Budapest and the same thing happened. And there they had what happened to the Jews at the end of the war, and unfortunately it was mainly a lot of Hungarians who gave them up.
Yeah.
And they had photographs, and a Hungarian friend of mine in Geneva said, the thing is, they have photographs of the people who were killed and photographs of the people who gave them up, and unfortunately a lot of those people are still alive and thriving. So it was a harrowing experience to go. I went with my friend, and both of us felt it was very powerful.
We were very fortunate. When I went back to, we went with Elizabeth and Demi back to Hungary for the first time, 1982, 83, whatever it was. And we had one cousin left. Virgie, my father's sister, had a daughter, Mimi, who was a young girl when we were in Maria Veshnu and kind of played with us. She was maybe, we were 6 and 5, and maybe she was 12, or, she was older than we were, so she was already kind of a young girl, young woman. And when we went back to Hungary, to Budapest, she was there, and we met her. And she had married first a very dashing military man, beautiful costume and very handsome guy. And they had a child, a girl. And then sometime later, he left her, he moved on, And she was a single woman, single mother for a long time. And then she married an older man, very articulate, bright, older guy, who had been the representative for a champagne company, one of the champagne companies, he'd been the representative in Budapest. And I remember once, I liked him very much. I visited there a number of times. And he was a very interesting, he was very interested in what was the United States like, and was it really this way and that way. Anyway, one day I was talking to him and I said, I really wonder where my grandparents lived in Budapest, because we had always visited them in Maria Beshener. By then, they'd given up the apartment in Budapest, so I had no idea where they lived in Budapest. So he said, well, let me look at the papers. I said, the papers? So he goes to a little anteroom they had. It was sort of a big studio apartment that my cousin lived in. Lovely location because you could open the windows and look out to the Danube. So it was a great location. Anyway, he opened up this drawer and he showed me these papers. And I asked him if I could borrow one of the papers and make a copy at the hotel. So I guess by then he trusted me enough to allow me to take this paper. And that was the wedding certificate of our grandparents, you know, of my grandmother and my grandfather, and then the witnesses, and so. And that was sort of the first time we had confirmation, because the wedding certificate was authenticated by a rabbi. So now we knew for sure what we had always suspected, which we never talked about as children. And that had an address, and so then we found the apartment where they had lived in Budapest. So that was a big discovery for us. Because in Vienna, we knew where we had lived, we knew where my grandmother's restaurant was, so we had lived there, and we knew that well. But Budapest was a different element. And then my cousin died, but her daughter is alive, and we were in touch with the daughter periodically, Maritza. And Maritza had the bust of my grandfather, which she recently had duplicated for me, so I have a copy of the bust of my grandfather Coleman in Huntington now. So what else can we tell you?
What did you guys do for schooling in Brazil? Did you go to school, or did your parents teach you?
In Itapapuena, we went to a one-room schoolhouse with a very pretty teacher, and I remember she had on a white blouse and a black skirt, and she was very pretty.
And there were children of all ages in there?
All ages, all, you know.
And could you speak Brazilian well enough to follow along?
I learned Portuguese extremely well, and forgot it just as quickly.
Yeah, I think we both, it's always
I can say
amazing.
sobremesa, which means dessert.
That's important.
And this was when something was good, you did this, and something was very good, you did that.
Oh.
No, it was amazing. Our parents struggled. I mean, they all spoke 3 or 4 languages, but they struggled, you know, in their age, 40s.
I spoke it so
you were
well.
speaking German first,
Yeah,
and then Portuguese.
I learned it
Hungarian. I went to
very,
school
very
in
well, so
Hungary.
they thought I was a native.
Really?
Yeah.
And they said I had no accent and I was
No.
fine, but I think when you're a child, it's very easy. You know, I was 5 years old, so.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I did forget it.
Mhm.
And then when we lived in Brazil, I mean, in Rio, we were in Rio first, then we went to this little village up in Rio. I went to a Catholic school with brothers or priests called Guy de Fongalon. Guy de Fongalon was a young boy. They had a picture of him there with a sort of a white floral ribbon on his arm, which must have been his, you know, first communion. So we spoke first, we were raised speaking German. Then we lived in Hungary for 3 months, and I went to school in Hungary,
He
and
picked
so we
us.
spoke Hungarian,
I didn't learn any Hungarian.
which drove my mother crazy because Hungarian is a very difficult language and she could never learn it.
Mhm.
But we were like children, we were immersed in it.
I don't think I went to school there.
Probably
I don't
not, I remember
remember.
going by myself. But you were immersed in it, so you speak it. And then we left and we went to Brazil and we were immersed in Portuguese, so we spoke Portuguese. And then on the way up from Brazil, by ship, we went on a freighter, so it took several weeks. My mother was teaching us English.
Yeah.
on the way here. The
Something,
first thing
Mary,
I went
Mary
on-
and Paul, or, I know it
Yeah.
was Paul, something
Yeah.
of Paul.
So
Little
the
brother and
children's book.
sister that she taught us English.
Yeah, was another family, you mean, other,
No, it was a book
oh,
to
about
teach us
Mary.
English.
Oh.
Yeah,
And we were not allowed off the boat.
yeah.
Because the quota to get into America for Hungarians was closed before the war, which was one of the reasons we couldn't go to America. When the war started and no people could really leave Europe anymore, the quota for Hungarians opened, and then my father could get permission to go to America. And I don't know if the story is right, that we went without passports, but we had a letter of good conduct from the consul from the American embassy in Rio, who knew my father and liked him very much, and he wrote a letter saying, I think this man would make a very good citizen. I don't know if that's true.
Well,
That's-
yeah,
And then each port we stopped between Rio and wherever we were going, we were not allowed off the ship, except in Bahia. 'Cause I remember Bahia going up
yeah.
in the elevator and visiting, I don't know how many churches they had, one church per year, per day. And after that, we had to stay on board.
Say, but they thought my father might be a spy. That was the story.
Really?
In Venezuela, we could get off in Venezuela, which was one of the ports we stopped in. But my sister and I, the story that my mother wrote was that we were trying to get the visa to go to the United States. So my parents were, going to the various embassies. So my father was at the American embassy talking to the consul to get the appropriate papers. And my mother went to the German embassy and she asked, what do we need from you? What kind of a paper do we need from you to go? And they said, well, we will give you the papers if your husband will change his first name to a clearly Jewish first name. And so my mother got very upset. So she ran over to the American embassy to tell my father, and she was visibly shaken and very angry that they would do this. And the consul came out, because he heard me talking, and said, what happened? And so she told him the story, and in her writing, that then got the consul to make the final decision to give us the papers. Now, the other problem they had was that in order to get into the United States, you needed to have an economic guarantor. Someone, either you needed to have money, or you needed to have someone who would assure the government that you wouldn't become
A burden.
dependent on the state.
Yeah.
And he had a very good friend in Hungary, who was now in Brazil, one of his closest friends, who ran an import-export business, and who offered to give him the money he needed in the United States, but he refused to take it because he said, well, you need that money for your business, so he wasn't helping himself. And finally, maybe by this thing that the Germans did to my mother, the consul then apparently gave us the permission. And when George Shultz was the Secretary of State, I asked if I could have access under the Freedom of Information to our file. And they said, sure. And so I wrote them and I said, I'm looking for a letter of authorization to allow us to enter the country. And they said,
1941.
they couldn't find any such letter, so I don't know whether it actually exists or not, or whether that was just a good story, or whether the letter was, they took the letter and then got rid of it, or someday we'll look again.
What was there was some sort of intrigue involved with people pursuing Grandpa and on the way out, that wasn't there was some issue of urgency.
Well, there was an issue of urgency in Vienna in 1938 because the Germans came in April of 1938, and within a week or 10 days, they put into effect all the laws that they had gradually put into effect in Germany, so that immediately they put the laws into effect that, you know, we're not allowed to have a profession, they were not allowed to work, they were not allowed to do a lot of things. And in the case of Grandpa, the first thing that happened is he lost his malpractice insurance. You know, so there were a series of steps being taken so he could no longer work. But the critical element was some friends of his, maybe fellow doctors, I know, were picked up and taken away. And he realized that, you know, the noose was closing on him, so he decided to try to leave. He didn't have a visa, he had no permission to leave, but he somehow talked his way past, took a train, somehow talked his way past whoever the guard was, and got to Vienna, and then wrote my mother a note saying, you know, I made it, but it was very...
You got to Hungary, to Budapest.
Yeah, but it was a very, you know,
Yeah, but
I can't remember the word he used, but, you know,
Harrowing.
a very frightening experience.
but when in Brazil though, there was wasn't there somebody who was pursuing them and?
Well, in Brazil, what happened was, he was out there in this little village, working for this German fellow who had this factory. And then that German fellow hired a German engineer.
Yeah.
And the German engineer, it turned out, was quite pro-Nazi and was writing pro-Nazi editorials for papers in the larger cities. And he somehow was determined to make life difficult for Grandpa. And so I guess there was a story that my father had been a spy when he was in Rio because of something that happened. So he went to Rio to demonstrate that that was false, which he did. But while he was in Rio, he had some drugs, codeine, that he could use for operations. And he had trained a young man in the factory to be sort of his assistant, and he told that young man where the drugs were. And the German engineer found out that this young man had access to the drugs. So he then went to the Baron, and basically they used that as an excuse to force my father to resign. But I guess I forgot to tell you, there was something else that had happened in the meantime. The German engineer had, because of his relationships with the German government, had gotten permission for the Baron to bring from Germany some road building equipment. So they had brought in road building equipment, and my mother finally went to the Baron and said, well, now you have the road building equipment, so you'll be able to build a road, a better road, to the town that has a doctor. So instead of it being, you know, a 5-hour trip, it might be a 1-hour trip. So maybe Grandpa is now expendable. And that was her, and she said the Baron, when she explained it to us, smiled, like, you know, you're not so dumb, are you? And then the pressure was put on my father that either he resign or they would report that he had given drugs to somebody who wasn't authorized to have drugs. Now, why my father was authorized to have drugs, I don't know, because he wasn't
have any
authorized to
license.
practice medicine.
Right.
But they used that, and my father then said to the Baron, well, you know, is this what you want? And the Baron said yes. You
So the
Basically, I
Baron's
want you to
head
get-
was turned by the engineer, I mean, his mind was changed by the
But
engineer.
he was.
Anyway, this is all it did, that what, we didn't know this, we were kids, you know. So all we knew is we were gonna go back to Rio. And then the story is, while we were in Rio, waiting to get on the ship, some of the native people, the locals from Barra, came down, and they offered my father a job, and all the villagers would chip in and hire him to be their doctor.
In the same village where the Baron and the
Yeah,
engineer were?
And my father, I guess,
No, thank
decided, no, I guess what my mother said is, that was what they had in mind, and they came to offer that when we were getting ready to leave. But then when they heard that we had gotten permission to leave, to go to the United States, then they decided to let us go. So we-
And is it true that Grandpa at one point went to the authorities when the war was over and he didn't realize that the war was over, and he went to the authorities to say, I haven't done anything wrong, you know, I wanna come out of hiding, basically, I want to present myself and, you know, show you that I'm an honest person, and somebody said, oh, didn't you know the war is over and you're free to go? Was that not?
No, that's a good story, but I don't think. What happened was, you know, when we got to the United States, it was April of '41.
Yeah.
And the war was raging in Europe, but we weren't yet in the war. And then in December, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, then the United States declared that, yes, it would go into the war against the Japanese, and also either the Germans declared war on us first, or we declared war on them, but then the World War started with everybody in it. And then Grandpa tried to enlist as a medical person, and they said, no, he was too old, you know, but then he was in his 40s, they weren't taking people out.
Didn't they have a picture of his
So-
medical bag and everything?
Yes.
for the-
Well, there were these civilian groups, you know, like, civilian groups that were available in case there was an attack or a bomb attack. These were the people who would go forward. So there was like auxiliary police or auxiliary firemen, they were the auxiliary medical. And we have a picture of them, you know, with a little uniform and whatever.
So, Dad, it's running up to 11:30. I don't know if you want to continue or you want to take a break and.
Well, I would
We
like to
can
go hear the
continue in
concert.
the,
What?
we can continue in the afternoon if you want.
Okay.
It's fun to
You
listen.
still have the story of the Brazil gamble that your father made with the fellow to get with the passport. Oh, he got something that was in the drawer that the fellow had. And he
Remember, yeah, how Grandpa was helped by the,
Yeah, and he knew that the Brazilian liked to gamble, and he
Yeah.
said, I'll bet you that you have that thing in there. I don't know what he made
Yeah,
it
no,
gamble.
he told you that story. I never heard that
You
story.
never heard it?
No. I think you told me once, but I never heard
Yeah,
it
my
from
mother
him.
tells that story.
Yeah.
She told me.
All right, well, we'll take a
Wait,
break
Amory
and.
has a
I have
question.
stories of things that I remember, you know, how they first met, and they had their first date, and my mother was late, and, you know, he was very upset because he thought, you know, where is she? And finally, he came to the house, and the roof of the restaurant had caught fire.
Okay, that's a good excuse.
I couldn't make the date, the house was burning. And how she got her first date, they used to go to a swimming pool. She went with this other man she knew, and my father belonged to the same society and was swimming in the same swimming pool. Speaking of people being in swimming pools.
Yeah.
And this man was sitting on the side of the pool with her, and he said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but I've been sent to someplace else to work, so I won't be able to come and bring you anymore. And my father said, oh, but I know you from the swimming pool. I'd be happy to take you to the swimming pool in the future.
But you also told me your mother, Grandma, was a beautiful animal. Woo-hoo, right.
Well, I know Dad wants to go to his, thanks.
On that happy note, we'll go to church.